the hour. But joining us now, it's Joel, the host of America's Roundtable Radio Program and co-founder, International Leaders Summit. Joel, good to see you again, sir.
A very good morning to you, Gerard, and to your listeners at SuperTalk Mississippi Media.
You bet. So we wanted to have you on to give us an update on the situation in Gaza. I guess the first question I'd ask you, Joel, is who can we rely on for credible reports, for information that is accurate about the situation? Because there is a lot of information, and best I can tell, there are a lot of conflicts coming out of the region, depending on the source. What's the truth, Joel, and how do we get to it?
That's a very good question, Gerard, and something that has really been a great concern for our fellow Americans as they're bombarded by images on social media. And we have been led to believe by mainstream media that whatever the Gaza Ministry of Health communicates, that's looked as if it's the real word. But we all know that Gaza's Ministry of Health is controlled by Hamas. And yes, there are some very good sources of information from Israel. We certainly have some great allies that are doing excellent reporting, accurate, dependable reporting from Israel, from the Gaza region. And we have the Jerusalem Post, we have Jewish News Syndicate. These are reporters on the ground. CBN News, which has done an extraordinary work with a number of reporters on the ground, with Chris Mitchell leading that effort as the Middle East Bureau Chief in Jerusalem. So these are great, credible sources. But as far as we are noticing what's coming up on our mainstream media, there is a tendency to take whatever Hamas says at its worth. And it's at its word. And we have to understand that Hamas is a terrorist group. They're the ones that perpetrated this horrific terrorist attack on Israelis on October 7, 2023, the worst day for Israelis since the Holocaust. And yet we are to believe what Hamas is saying as far as the numbers of individuals killed. We don't know how many of them were Hamas terrorists in that number. So we certainly have to be very discerning and certainly look at key sources of information from within Israel, such as JNS.org, Jerusalem Post, CBN News. There are three really reliable sources.
You know, the president is receiving lots of calls from members of his own party, the Squad in particular, and some others as well, to encourage Israel just to cease fire and just to discontinue any retaliation or any attempts to root out these terrorists that caused these horrific events which we saw on October the 7th and to some degree after. The president seems to be in a bit of a pickle here on this matter when he's got members of his own party that are encouraging him to work with Netanyahu to do so, to call a ceasefire. Do you think he's going to cave on this? And he seems to just be a little tentative, even in denouncing Hamas, in my view, and trying to straddle the fence here. Is that a good political strategy? And more importantly, where does that leave our most faithful ally, Israel?
That's a very good question as well, Gerard. In fact, this is the time to stand with Israel shoulder to shoulder. And in fact, the efforts that we have been seeing taking place whereby President Biden is communicating a 3-day ceasefire request to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. At this time, there ought not to be a ceasefire whatsoever. Hamas has not released the hostages, over 240 hostages, a number of them American hostages. And so we have to go back to the premise of the ceasefire existed until October 6, 2023. And look what happened. And today we have over 10,000 rockets that were fired from Gaza into Israel proper. There's no attempt on the part of Hamas to slow down its operations. So I think what we're seeing right now is that Hamas is using its allies and the media to really push this narrative that they need a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes or whatever. But the ceasefire will be used by Hamas for their purposes to rearm
Yeah.
its terrorists, and that we cannot certainly accept. Israel, its work to root out Hamas, this ground incursion is so important, and they are working to rescue the hostages as well.
I mean, it seems to me like Israel's been somewhat patient given the horrors that were inflicted on their civilian population. Civilians, not going after the IDF, the Israeli military, but on civilians. And here we are a month later, and they've engaged somewhat, but I think out of an abundance of caution and in an attempt at all cost to avoid inflicting civilian casualties, I think they've been really rather mild in their response.
In fact, Israel's response has been very measured, as you have rightfully mentioned. In fact, as we remember right during the early days, there were targeted strikes targeting Hamas terrorist networks. Then Israel communicated through leaflets, through phone messages, through all forms of communication, including social media, to encourage the Gazans to go south. Now we're seeing more than 200,000 Gazans moving down south where there is a safe refuge for them, and humanitarian supplies are coming in, some 100 trucks per day to provide assistance. But the question should be asked in that response is that, the Israelis have done more than anyone else would have. No other country warns its enemies that they're going to be coming in with a ground incursion or a ground invasion and allows so much time. It was weeks before Israel actually began their ground operations. So they are a rule of law nation. Israel is a rule of law nation, and they are working steadfastly to make sure that they respect the international law, the war that is being engaged right now, and saving lives. Instead, what we see Hamas doing is using Gazans as human shields, using hospitals, schools, mosques. That's where they have their areas of operation. In fact, their military terrorist organization is found underneath some of these hospitals. So we're facing a very vicious terrorist network backed by Iran. And Iran is the source of all evil that is permeating through this region right now.
We should also point out that there have been multiple incidents involving U.S. military personnel as well as U.S. military installations and assets. And this country really hasn't done a great deal in the form of retaliation. Is this a sign of weakness on the part of our president?
In fact, over the past month, Gerard, 50 strikes targeted U.S. military installations in Iraq as well as in Syria. And let us not forget that even our Navy fleet was attacked by the Houthis in Yemen. And indeed, our response has not been something that has deterred Iran. In fact, they're more emboldened. Over the past year, we noticed that there were a great number of attacks, but it was underreported. So rather than pinprick strikes, they ought to be more targeted strikes that send Iran a strong message that America is not going to tolerate them trying to increase or actually enlarge this conflict and expand it. And Iran, are using Hezbollah up in the north. They're using Hamas in Gaza. They're using the Houthis. And the main culprit is Iran, and we are not addressing it. We do need strong leadership in the White House, and Congress also has a responsibility to address these issues too. It has to be done urgently before this escalates into a much wider Middle Eastern conflict, drawing in all the wrong actors such as China and Russia.
Yeah, we got to go, Joel, but it just seems to me like that maybe the best strategy would be for the president to draw the so-called red line and then act on any breach any incursion of that red line as a deterrent. But I haven't seen anything come out of the White House at this point in that regard. Joel, always appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom on these matters and your insight. I'm sure we'll be talking soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gerard.